The heavy rhythmic thrum of the amethyst spire's life support systems vibrated through the soles of Jaxon Vane's boots, a constant reminder that he was walking through the gut of a living machine. It was a cold indigo sound, one that hummed in the bones of those who didn't belong. Every step forward sent a jagged spike of white-hot agony through his wrists. The resonance shackles were doing their job well, not just binding his flesh, but whispering a low-frequency hum into his nervous system that made every thought feel like it was being dragged through wet sand. "Move, Dustwalker," one of the wardens growled. The alien's voice didn't come from a throat, but from a translation diaphragm grafted onto its chest, rendering the melodic Xylos language into a flat, metallic English. The guard's hand, elongated and covered in skin the color of a bruised plum, shoved a kinetic baton into the small of Jackson's back. Jaxon stumbled, his breath catching in a throat that felt like it had been scoured with iron filings. He didn't give them the satisfaction of a groan. He'd spent 41 years in a universe that excelled at breaking things, and he wasn't about to let a couple of purple-skinned thugs in ceremonial glass armor be the ones to finally finish the job. He straightened his spine, the movement causing his worn prisoner's jumpsuit to pull against the thick map of scar tissue covering his back. The corridor they navigated was a masterpiece of biological engineering. The walls were formed from spiraling columns of translucent violet crystal, interlaced with veins of glowing lumen fiber that pulsed with the steady heartbeat of the spire. It was beautiful, Jaxon admitted silently. Beautiful and utterly indifferent to the man walking toward his own execution. "They're waiting," the other warden added, its metallic eyes, gold spheres without pupils, scanning Jaxon with a clinical detachment. "The High Counselor's in a foul mood. He hates it when the debris talks back." Jaxon stared straight ahead. "Don't let them in," he reminded himself. "Don't let the silence break you." He'd been in this hole for 3 days. 3 days of darkness, sensory deprivation, and questions about transmission codes he didn't have, in military outposts he'd never seen. He was just a freelancer, a guy who hauled surplus medical supplies to the dirt-side colonies because no legitimate corporation would touch a man with a blacklisted service record. The wardens guided him toward a set of massive, arching doors crafted from a single slab of obsidian-like rock. As they approached, the lumen fibers in the doors flared into a blinding brilliance, sensing the biometric signatures of the guards. With a sound like a distant avalanche, the obsidian split down the middle, sliding into the walls to reveal the Hall of Celestial Judgment. The scale of the room was enough to make a man feel like an insect. The ceiling was a vast dome of transparent polymer, looking out into the swirling amethyst clouds of the planet below. Thousands of Xylos nobles sat in tiered rows, their robes of shifting silk creating a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to move in synchronization with the pulsing light of the walls. At the center of the hall stood a raised dais, and upon it sat the leaders of the hegemony. Jaxon recognized High Counselor Valerius immediately. The old alien was draped in heavy crystalline robes, his skin a pale, withered lilac. He looked like a vulture perched atop a pile of shining bones, his eyes fixed on Jaxon with a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with power. And above him, on a throne that seemed to be grown from the very bedrock of the spire, sat the Empress. Jaxon kept his head bowed as protocol demanded, but he caught a glimpse of her. She was a silhouette of silver and deep blue, her presence an anchor in the chaotic sea of light and noise. He felt the weight of her gaze, a physical pressure that seemed to bypass the resonance shackles and probe at the edges of his mind. The wardens forced him to his knees at the base of the dais. The impact sent a fresh wave of pain through his joints. "The accused is Jaxon Vane," the herald's voice boomed, echoing through the chamber. "Former combatant of the Aegis Mandate, current trespasser, accused of high espionage and violations against the sanctity of the hegemony." Valerius stood, his movements slow and theatrical. He held a data glass in one hand, flickering with distorted images of Jackson's ship, the Rust Bucket. "You were found in the Vesper system," Valerius began, his voice amplified by the room's acoustics. "A restricted zone, carrying sensor arrays that far exceed the requirements of a simple cargo vessel. Tell us, human, who paid for your eyes? Which Terran general thinks he can peek into our nurseries without being blinded?" Jaxon looked up, his gray eyes meeting the counselor's yellow glare. "I've told your interrogators a dozen times," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "My nav comp glitched. I was running vaccines to the New Horizon colony. If I was a spy, I'd have a ship that didn't leak oil every time I hit a slipstream." A ripple of laughter, a high-pitched chirping sound, ran through the Xylos court. Valerius's face darkened, the plum tint of his skin deepening. "Your humor is as primitive as your species," the counselor hissed. "The evidence is clear. You were mapping our orbital defenses. You are a ghost, Vane, a man with no home and no record, the kind of man who sells his soul for a few credits and a chance to hurt those he cannot understand." Jaxon felt the red mist of anger begin to rise. He'd spent 7 years being told he was nothing, but hearing it from this gilded scavenger was almost more than he could bear. He opened his mouth to snap a retort, to tell Valerius exactly where he could shove his evidence, but a sudden shift in the atmosphere stopped him. The music of the room, the low ambient hum of the crystals, changed. It dropped into a minor key, becoming solemn and expectant. Valerius bowed his head. "The Empress wishes to hear the prisoner's final plea before sentencing." Silence descended, absolute and suffocating. Jaxon felt the shackles tighten, the resonance frequency shifting to force him into a state of submission. He struggled against the urge to collapse, forcing his lungs to draw in the thin, recycled air. He looked toward the throne, toward the woman who held his life in her hands. "Speak," the Empress said. The word was a melody, a sound that bypassed the translation graphs and settled deep in Jackson's chest. It was a voice he hadn't heard in 7 long, bitter years. A voice that had once been a frightened whisper in the dark, humming a song of forgotten dawns. Jackson's heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. He forgot about Valerius. He forgot about the thousands of hostile eyes watching him. He forgot about the pain in his wrists. He focused only on the silver-haired figure above him. "You're alive," he whispered, the words so quiet they barely carried past his own lips. Valerius sneered. "Speak up, human. The court does not have all day for your whimpering." Jaxon took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto the golden irises of the Empress. For the first time in the trial, he didn't sound like a weary prisoner. He sounded like the soldier he had once been. "My name is Jaxon Vane," he said, his voice ringing through the hall of celestial judgment with a clarity that silenced the room. "And I didn't come here to spy on you. I came here because I'm tired of running from the things I couldn't save. I've spent 7 years thinking the fire finally caught up with everyone at Aurelia Prime. If you're going to kill me, counselor, then do it. But don't you dare tell me I don't understand sacrifice. I've paid for it in blood, and I've got the receipts etched into my skin." High above him, the Empress went rigid. She stood up from the throne, a movement so sudden and so contrary to 1,000 years of royal protocol that the nobles gasped in unison. She leaned over the railing of the dais, her silver hair cascading down like a frozen waterfall, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning recognition. The spire's walls began to glow a vibrant, burning orange, the color of a Xylos soul in turmoil. "That voice," she whispered, her English perfect, unassisted by any machine. "I know that voice. 7 years earlier. The Aurelia Prime incident." The sky over Aurelia Prime wasn't blue. It was a bruised, bleeding orange, choked with the soot of 1,000 fires and the ionized trails of orbital kinetic strikes. Jaxon Vane felt the atmospheric friction rattling his teeth as his Aegis Mandate drop pod punched through the cloud layer. He was 2,400 meters above the surface, and the world below looked like a shattered mirror reflecting a funeral pyre. "Check your 6, Vane," a voice crackled in his helmet. It was Sergeant Miller, his tone tight with the kind of stress that only comes when you realize the humanitarian mission has just turned into a meat grinder. "The hegemony's anti-air batteries are zapping everything that moves. We're scattered." "Copy that, Sarge," Jaxon gritted out, his hands dancing across the manual override controls. "Engaging thrusters. I'm coming down in Sector 9. Looks like the market district is a total wash." The pod slammed into the ground with a force that would have liquefied a man without the inertial dampeners of his Aegis armor. The hatch blew outward, and Jackson rolled into the dust, his pulse rifle leveled before he even finished his rotation. The air tasted of ozone and the sweet, sickly stench of burning Xylo's vegetation, a scent he'd come to associate with the end of things. Aurelia Prime had been a jewel of the buffer zone, a world where Terran and Xylos traders had once walked side by side. Now it was a charnel house. The soaring spires of singing crystal were collapsing into themselves, their melodic vibrations replaced by the screaming of stressed metal and the thud of plasma mortars. Jackson activated his long-range comms. "Command, this is Vane. I'm down. No sign of the rest of the squad. Thermal signatures are a mess down here. Everything is burning." "Negative, Vane." The response came through a thick layer of static. "Mission is scrubbed. The hegemony just moved a heavy-hitter fleet into the system. High Command is pulling the plug. Extraction shuttles are leaving in 3 hours from the north side pad. Get there or you're on your own. Bug out, soldier." "That's an order." Jackson looked around at the ruins. A child's toy, a small hover gyro, lay crushed in the red dirt. A few meters away, the arm of a Xylos merchant protruded from beneath a slab of lumen fiber concrete. "Understood, Command," Jackson lied. He didn't move toward the north. He moved deeper into the smoke. He was a rescue worker, and his soul didn't know how to turn around when the screams were still audible. He found her in the wreckage of what had been a library. The building was a nightmare of jagged crystal and flickering light. She was pinned beneath a fallen structural beam, her skin, a vibrant, youthful blue, slick with silver blood. She couldn't have been more than 18 by human standards, her golden eyes wide with a shock that transcended language. "Easy, easy," Jackson said, holstering his rifle and dropping to his knees beside her. He didn't have a translator, but he had the universal language of a field medic. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his heavy gauntlet a stark contrast to her fragile frame. "I've got you. Just breathe." The girl whimpered, a sound like a wounded bird. She pointed at her legs, then at the sky, where the distant hum of hegemony gunships grew louder. She was trying to tell him to run. She thought he was the enemy, or perhaps she just knew that staying here was a death sentence for both of them. "I'm not leaving you to be fragged by your own people," Jackson muttered. He looked at the beam. It was a massive piece of singing crystal, still vibrating with a low, mournful tone. He didn't have the equipment to lift it, but he had a soldier's desperation. He scavenged a piece of rebar from a nearby pillar and jury-rigged a lever. He strained against the weight, his Aegis suit's servos whining in protest. The scar tissue on his back, souvenirs from a previous skirmish, pulled and burned, but he didn't stop. With a final, agonizing heave, the crystal shifted. The girl gasped as he pulled her free, her left leg a ruined mess of bone and torn tissue. Jackson didn't waste time. He ripped open his trauma kit and jammed a biofoam injector into her thigh. The foam expanded, sealing the wound and dulling the pain. "Can you walk?" he asked, then realized how stupid the question was. He scooped her up, her weight almost nothing in his armored arms. They took shelter in the basement of the ruins as the first wave of aerial bombardment began. The ground shook with the rhythmic thud of plasma strikes, the shock waves turning the air into a physical weight. Dust and fragments of crystal fell like snow around them. The girl huddled against his chest, her fingers clutching the ceramic plating of his vest. She was humming something, a low, repetitive melody that seemed to be the only thing keeping her sane. "Don't worry," Jackson whispered, his back turned to the door, his body acting as a shield against the debris. "I've got you. I'm a heavy-duty fixer, remember? We're going to make it out of this hole." He talked to her for an hour, telling her stories about Earth, about the green forests of his home, and the way the rain smelled on a summer afternoon. He didn't know if she understood a single word, but he saw the tension leave her shoulders. She looked at him with an intensity that made him feel seen in a way he never had before. Not as a soldier, not as a tool of the mandate, but as a man. The bombardment reached a fever pitch. A plasma mortar hit the street directly outside, the thermal surge melting the door of their shelter. Jackson threw himself over the girl, his back absorbing the spray of superheated shrapnel. Agony exploded in his nervous system. He felt his armor fail, the warning lights in his HUD flashing a frantic red. He tasted copper in his mouth and smelled the stench of his own charred skin. He didn't move. He held her tighter, his teeth gritted until he felt them crack. "Stay down," he gasped. When the fire finally ceased, the silence was more terrifying than the noise. Jaxon could barely feel his legs. His vision was a blurred tunnel of gray and red. Through the haze, he saw the girl. She was unhurt, her face streaked with soot, but her golden eyes clear. She was looking at him with a mixture of awe and absolute, heart-wrenching grief. She reached out, her fingers brushing the jagged hole in his shoulder armor where the shrapnel had buried itself. She whispered something, a phrase that sounded like a prayer. "Will not forget," his damaged translator finally sputtered, catching the fragment of her words. "Never forget." Then the roar of engines, not the whine of hegemony gunships, but the heavy industrial thrum of a human rescue shuttle. His beacon had worked. Jaxon tried to stand, but his body had finally reached its limit. He collapsed back into the rubble, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. The medics swarmed the room, their white uniforms a blur of movement. "Take her," Jaxon croaked, pointing a trembling hand at the girl. "She's a non-combatant. Take her first." The medics hesitated, looking at the Xylos girl. "That's an order, soldier," Jaxon roared, the last of his strength pouring into the command. They moved then, lifting her onto a stretcher. She fought them for a moment, her eyes locked on Jaxon as they carried her toward the light. She reached out her hand, her fingers stretching toward him until the shadows swallowed her. Jaxon closed his eyes, the darkness of the basement feeling like a warm blanket. He'd screwed the pooch, he knew. He'd ignored orders, risked a multi-million credit suit, and probably ended his career for an enemy civilian who'd likely die in a refugee camp anyway. But as he felt the medics lifting him, Jaxon Vane smiled. He hadn't been a tool today. He'd been a person. And in a universe that loved to break things, he'd actually managed to keep one thing whole. Present day, the Hall of Celestial Judgment. The memory faded, leaving Jaxon blinking in the brilliant light of the spire. The silence in the throne room was so thick it felt like it had mass. The Empress was still standing, her golden eyes fixed on his face with a hunger that seemed to bridge the 7-year void. She didn't look like a queen right now. She looked like the girl in the basement, the one who had promised never to forget. Counselor Valerius looked from his sovereign to the prisoner, his face pale. "Majesty, this human's insolence has reached a point where—" "Silence, Valerius," Laraxis whispered. Her voice wasn't melodic anymore. It was a blade of ice. She began to walk down the steps of the dais. The wardens shifted uncomfortably, their hands twitching toward their weapons. But a single sharp glance from the Empress froze them in place. She approached Jaxon until she was standing only inches away. The scent of ozone and wildflowers, the same perfume he'd caught earlier, washed over him. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the heavy iron of his resonant shackles. "You came back," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. Jaxon looked up at her, a weary, lopsided grin touching his lips. "I told you, I've got a terrible sense of direction. I always end up in the wrong neighborhood." Lyraxis didn't laugh. She turned toward the court, her eyes burning with a golden fire that made the lumen fibers in the walls scream with light. "Wardens, release him," she commanded. "But Majesty," Valerius shrieked, stepping forward. "He is an accused spy. He is the man who carried me through the fire when my own kindred fled," Lyraxis roared, her voice echoing like thunder. "He is the man whose blood still stains the ruins of Aurelia Prime so that I might breathe. He is not a prisoner of this court. He is a guest of the throne." She turned back to Jaxon, her expression softening into something so vulnerable it made his chest ache. She touched the control panel on his shackles, her thumb pressing into the biometric sensor. The iron fell away with a heavy clatter. Jaxon rubbed his raw wrists, the relief of the resonance hum stopping being almost as painful as the pain itself. He stood up slowly, his joints popping, his height nearly matching hers. Lyraxis reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I looked for you, Jaxon Vane. I looked for 7 years. I was around," Jaxon said softly. "Just hiding in the margins." "No more," she said, her voice regaining its royal steel. She turned back to the stunned assembly, her hand catching his and gripping it tight. Alien skin against human, cold against warm, hope against fear. The era of isolation is over. If this man could see a person instead of an enemy in the midst of a burning city, then we have no excuse to do anything less. Valerius backed away, his eyes darting around the room as he realized the tide had shifted. The nobles were murmuring, not with laughter this time, but with a strange, hesitant wonder. Jaxon looked at the girl he'd saved, now a queen of an empire. He saw the danger in the shadows, the political wolves already sharpening their teeth, and the impossible road ahead. He felt like he was back in that drop pod, falling through a bleeding sky. "You know this is going to be a total clusterfuck, right?" Jaxon whispered, leaning close to her ear. Lyraxis squeezed his hand, a radiant, dangerous smile lighting up her face. "I believe the human term is light it up, Jaxon Vane. Let us give them a show they will never forget." The transition from the resonant shackles to the silken sheets of the guest wing was not as smooth as the Xylos propaganda might have suggested. For Jaxon Vane, the silence of the luxury suite was louder than the humming of the detention block. It was a pressurized, expectant quiet, the kind of stillness that precedes a hull breach or a planetary bombardment. He sat on the edge of a bed that felt like it was woven from moonlight and clouds. The room was a circular chamber within the higher strata of the amethyst spire, where the air was oxygen-rich and scented with the crisp, metallic tang of the upper atmosphere. The walls were not obsidian here, but a warm, translucent alabaster shot through with veins of sapphire lumen fiber. They pulsed in time with his own heartbeat, a symbiotic feature of Xylos architecture that Jaxon found deeply invasive. "You're pacing in your head, Jaxon Vane," a voice murmured from the doorway. He didn't startle. He had been tracking the vibration of her footsteps through the floor plates for the last 30 seconds. Lyraxis stood there, framed by the archway. She had shed her heavy ceremonial robes for a tunic of shimmering charcoal silk that clung to her frame like a second skin. Without the crown, she looked less like a deity and more like the survivor he remembered, though the years of ruling 17 star systems had etched a certain iron-willed gravity into the corners of her golden eyes. "It's an old habit," Jaxon said, his voice still carrying the gravelly edge of a man who hadn't used it for anything but grit for a long time. "Hard to turn off the internal radar when you're sitting in the middle of a total snafu." Lyraxis stepped into the room, the lumen fibers in the floor brightening to a soft amber as she moved. "A snafu. My translator identifies that as an acronym for a situation gone catastrophically wrong. Do you feel our reunion is a catastrophe?" Jaxon stood up, wincing as the movement pulled at the fresh biofoam graphs on his wrists. "The reunion? No. But the politics? Lyra, you just slapped the face of every high-ranking brass hat in this empire. You stood up for a dustwalker in front of 1,000 nobles who think I'm something the cat dragged in. That counselor, Valerius? He looked like he wanted to turn me into a localized debris field right there on the floor." Lyraxis walked to the window, looking out at the 3 moons of Xylos Prime as they traced their slow, luminous arcs across the sky. "Valerius is a relic of the old expansion. He believes that trust is a finite resource, something to be hoarded and used only against one's own blood. He sees your presence as a contamination. He doesn't understand that the bridge we built 7 years ago is stronger than any fleet he commands." "Bridges get bombed, Lyra," Jaxon said, moving to stand a respectful distance behind her. "I've spent the last 7 years watching people tear down everything I tried to build. After Aurelia Prime, the Earth Coalition didn't want a hero who saved an enemy. They wanted a scapegoat. They erased me, my record, my pension, my identity, all of it down the tubes because I chose to be a person instead of a weapon." Lyraxis turned to face him, her expression a complex tapestry of guilt and determination. "I know. I found the sealed files 3 years ago. I spent 2 million credits in black market data mining just to find the name of the insurgent lieutenant who had supposedly abandoned his post. When I realized what they had done to you, what I had inadvertently cost you, I felt a shame that no crown could hide." She reached out, her cool blue-tinted fingers hovering just inches from the scars on his neck. Jaxon didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. The gap between them was more than 7 years. It was the weight of 1,000 political compromises and 1 million lost lives. The Joint Rescue Corps, Jackson said, shifting the subject. You're serious about that? You want to put humans and Xylos in the same pods, hunting for survivors in contested zones? That's a tall order, even for an empress. It is the only way to stop the bleeding, Lyraxis replied, her voice regaining its royal steel. The proxy wars are draining us both. If we can prove that our species can work together to save lives, the narrative of inevitable conflict dies. I need you to lead it, Jackson. Not because you are a soldier, but because you are the only man I know who can see through the smoke. Jackson let out a short, dry laugh. You want a symbol. You want the Mercy of Aurelia to be the face of your new department. But I'm just a guy who fixes broken engines and runs vaccines to places the big ships won't go. I'm not a diplomat. I don't need a diplomat, she stepped closer, the scent of ozone and wildflowers intensifying. I have thousands of those. They are experts at saying nothing with many words. I need a man who stays when the bombs start falling. I need the man who hummed an earth lullaby to a terrified girl while his own life force was leaking into the dirt. Jackson looked away, his gray eyes catching the reflection of the spire's lights in the window. That man died in that basement, Lyra. The guy standing here is just a collection of scar tissue and bad memories. Then we will build someone new, Lyraxis whispered. The moment was interrupted by a low, urgent chime from the room's communication terminal. The light on the console flickered a frantic purple. Lyraxis frowned, moving to activate the display. The holographic image of High Counselor Valerius materialized in the center of the room. He looked even more like a bird of prey in the flickering light, his eyes darting toward Jackson with undisguised loathing. Majesty, Valerius began, his tone a mockery of respect. I apologize for the intrusion into your private deliberations. However, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. A human destroyer, the UNS Vengeance, has just dropped out of slipstream at the edge of our sovereignty. They are demanding the immediate return of their citizen, Jaxon Vane. They claim that any delay will be viewed as an act of war. Jackson felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. The Vengeance? That's Admiral Thorne's flagship. He's a hardliner. He doesn't come for a rescue. He comes for a fight. Valerius's smile was thin and sharp. It seems your guest of the throne has brought a storm to our doorstep, Majesty. The council is already meeting. They are discussing whether to hand the prisoner over or to engage the intruder. I suggest you conclude your cultural exchange and join us. The hologram vanished, leaving the room in a heavy indigo gloom. Lyraxis looked at Jackson, her golden eyes burning with a sudden, fierce light. They want to force my hand, she said. They want to make this about species again, to drown our hope in the noise of warships. Jackson reached for the simple tunic the attendants had left for him, his movements crisp and military. They want to fight, Lyra, and if I know Thorne, he's already got his targeting locks on your orbital relays. This whole thing is about to go foobar. Not yet, Lyraxis said, her hand catching his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, a reminder that her species possessed a biological density that belied their elegant appearance. We have 1 hour before the council votes, 1 hour to prove that the contamination is actually the cure. Jackson looked at her, seeing the girl in the ruins and the queen on the throne all at once. What do you want me to do? Do what you do best, Jaxon Vane, she said, a dangerous smile touching her lips. Fix it. 7 years earlier, the market of singing stones. The basement of the library was a tomb of dust and dying echoes. Jaxon Vane could feel the heat from the surface through his boots, a steady baking radiation that suggested the city above was being systematically erased from the map. He looked down at the girl. She was shivering despite the tropical heat of the basement. Her silver blood had matted the fur-like fuzz on her arms, and her breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. The biofoam had stopped the worst of the bleeding, but her left leg was twisted at an angle that made Jackson's own stomach churn. Stay with me, kid, Jackson gritted out. He was busy stripping the emergency power cell from his suit's auxiliary pack. I need you to keep humming that tune. It's the only thing keeping the sensors from picking up our biosigns. He didn't actually know if that was true, but the girl needed a task. She looked at him, Her golden eyes dilated until the pupils were thin, vertical slits of terror. She began to hum again, a low melodic vibration that seemed to resonate with the singing crystal beams above them. It was a haunting sound, one that felt like it belonged to a time before the galaxy had learned how to manufacture hatred on an industrial scale. Jaxon checked his suit's HUD. The integrity of his backplate was at 20%. The shrapnel from the plasma mortar had punched through the ceramic weave and buried itself in the muscle near his spine. Every time he moved, a red curtain of pain threatened to drop over his vision. He'd injected himself with 2 doses of Stimamp, but his heart was racing like a malfunctioning reactor, and he knew he was burning through his reserves. "Command, this is Vane," he whispered into his helmet. "Do you copy? I'm in the Sector 9 library basement. I have a non-combatant critical injuries. I need a pickup at these coordinates. Over." Silence, then a wash of static that sounded like 1,000 angry wasps. "Vane, abandon, sector, glassing, in 60 minutes. Leave." The transmission cut out. Jaxon stared at the timer on his wrist. 58 minutes. In less than an hour, the Earth Coalition's orbital platforms would fire their kinetic rods, turning everything within 100 kilometers into a sea of radioactive slag. It was a standard denial of assets protocol. If they couldn't hold Aurelia Prime, they would make sure the hegemony inherited nothing but a crater. "Damn it all to hell," Jaxon muttered. He looked at the girl. She had stopped humming. She was watching him, her hand reaching out to touch the Aegis Mandate insignia on his chest. "Lyra," she whispered. Jaxon blinked. "Is that your name?" "Lyra?" She nodded, pointing to herself. "Lyraxis." And then she pointed at him, her head tilting in inquiry. "Jaxon," he said, tapping his own chest. "Jaxon Vane. And right now, Jaxon Vane is wondering how he's going to get you 50 meters up and 2 kilometers north without both of us getting pancaked." He stood up, the pain in his back nearly causing him to black out. He scavenged a piece of reinforced lumen fiber from the floor and began to fashion a crude splint for her leg. As he worked, he felt her watching his hands. They were scarred, grease-stained, and trembling, but they were gentle. "Enemy," she said suddenly. It was the only word she had picked up from the broken translator. Jaxon paused, his fingers tightening around the splint. He looked at her, seeing the blue skin and the golden eyes that his training manuals told him were the marks of a predatory species. He thought of the 40 men in his platoon who had been decommissioned by Xylos snipers 3 months prior. He thought of the propaganda vids of Xylos boarding parties glassing civilian transports. Then he looked at her again. She was just a girl. She was scared. She was hurting. And she had a name. "No," Jaxon said, his voice soft. "Not today. Today we're just 2 idiots in a basement." He finished the splint and scooped her up into his arms. She was lighter than a human of her size, her bones a honeycomb of organic crystal that made her feel fragile, like a piece of fine porcelain. He navigated the crumbling stairs, his suit's servos screaming in protest as he carried the extra weight. When they emerged onto the street, the world was a nightmare of orange light and falling ash. The singing stones of the market were no longer singing. They were screaming as they cracked under the intense heat. A hegemony patrol vehicle, a sleek, hovering skiff, drifted past the end of the alleyway, its red searchlights sweeping the rubble. Jaxon pressed his back against a smoldering wall, shielding Lyraxis with his body. He could feel her heart beating against his chest, a frantic, rapid thrum. "Stay quiet," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't understand. The skiff moved on, its engines a low-frequency hum that vibrated in Jackson's teeth. He began to run, a staggering, lopsided gait that ate up the distance toward the north side extraction pad. His HUD was a mess of red warnings. Oxygen low. Power critical. Neural feedback detected. He made it 1 kilometer before his legs gave out. He collapsed into a crater, his lungs burning as if he were inhaling molten lead. He rolled onto his side, ensuring Lyraxis didn't take the impact. I can't," he wheezed, his vision blurring. Lyraxis scrambled out of his arms, her splinted leg dragging behind her. She looked at him, then at the sky, then back at his face. She reached into a small hidden pocket of her tunic and pulled out a pendant. It was a single uncut shard of singing crystal, pulsing with a deep, rhythmic indigo light. She pressed it into his palm. "Vane," she said, her voice full of a sudden, desperate strength. "Vane, stay." The crystal felt warm in his hand. It began to vibrate, a frequency that seemed to harmonize with his suit's failing power cell. Jaxon felt a surge of artificial energy hiss through his nervous system, a crude, biological jumpstart that cleared the fog from his mind. "Thanks, kid," Jaxon coughed, forcing himself back to his feet. "I owe you one." They reached the extraction pad with 10 minutes to spare. A human shuttle, a bulky, scarred Pelican-class craft, was idling on the scorched tarmac, its rear ramp down. A squad of medics and soldiers were frantically loading the last of the survivors. "Hey, over here!" Jaxon roared, waving his one functioning arm. The soldiers turned, their rifles snapping up before they realized it was one of their own. "It's Vane! He's got an extra!" Jaxon reached the ramp, his strength finally deserting him. He fell to his knees, sliding Laraxis onto the metal flooring of the shuttle. "Take her!" he shouted at the medic who rushed forward. "She's non-combatant. Priority 1. The medic, a young guy with Gomez stenciled on his chest, looked at the Xylos girl with a mixture of shock and hesitation. "Sir, she's a blue skin. The orders are—" "I don't give a damn about the orders." Jaxon lunged forward, grabbing Gomez by the collar of his vest. "Look at her! She's just a kid. You put her on a stretcher, or I'll use my last stim pack to shove you out of this bird. Move!" Gomez moved. They lifted Laraxis onto a medical bed, her golden eyes never leaving Jackson's face. As they began to strap her in, she reached out, her fingers catching Jackson's hand. She said something then, a long, flowing sentence in her own tongue. "She says," the ship's onboard translator hummed, its voice flickering through the cabin speakers. "Even in the fire the bridge is built. I will find the song of Jaxon Vane." The ramp hissed shut. Jaxon felt the G-force of the takeoff slam him against the bulkhead. He looked down at his hand, where the singing crystal shard still lay, glowing with a soft, defiant indigo. He didn't see the glassing of Aurelia Prime. He was already unconscious by the time the kinetic rods hit the atmosphere, turning the city into a memory. But in his dreams, he still heard the humming. He still felt the weight of a name that he had no right to save, and a debt that the universe would one day demand he pay. Present day, the amethyst spire. The memory of the ash felt more real to Jaxon than the luxury of the guest suite. He looked at Laraxis, who was now standing by the terminal, her fingers flying across a holographic interface as she prepared to face her council. "They think they can intimidate me with a destroyer," she said, her back to him. "They think that because you are human, your life is a bargaining chip." Jaxon walked over to her, his hand reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small worn object, a shard of singing crystal, its edges smoothed by 7 years of being carried in a pocket. It no longer glowed, its energy long since spent, but it still felt warm. "They're wrong, Lyra," Jaxon said. "Thorn isn't here for me. He's here for the excuse. He needs a reason to show the brass back home that the Xylos hegemony is still the big bad wolf. If you hand me over, he wins. If you fight him, he wins." Laraxis looked at the crystal, her breath hitching. She reached out and touched it, her fingers brushing Jackson's. "Then we don't do either," she said. She looked up at him, her golden eyes sharp with a plan that only a girl who had survived a massacre could devise. "You told me once that you were a heavy-duty fixer, Jaxon Vane. It's time to see if you can fix an empire. What do you have in mind?" "We are going to give Admiral Thorn exactly what he wants," Laraxis said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, melodic whisper. "A diplomatic incident so big that neither side can afford to walk away from the table. We're going to broadcast the right of recognition. Every human and Xylos screen in the sector is about to see their empress acknowledging a debt of blood to a blacklisted rescue worker." Jaxon stared at her. "That's a suicide run, Lyra. Valerius will have your head for it." "He can try," she said, her hand tightening around the crystal shard. "But trust is a powerful thing, Jaxon. It's time we showed them what it looks like when it isn't shackled." The spire groaned, a deep, resonant vibration that suggested the UNS Vengeance had just fired a warning shot across their bow. Jaxon checked his internal radar. The snafu was reaching critical mass. "All right, Empress," Jaxon said, a lopsided grin returning to his face. "Let's get to work. I've always been better at fixing things when the world is on fire anyway." They left the room together, walking back toward the Hall of Celestial Judgment. This time, there were no wardens. There were no shackles. There was only a veteran with a map of scars and a queen with a debt, moving toward a future that had been 7 years in the making. Outside, the moons of Xylos Prime shone down on a galaxy that was about to find out that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the universe isn't a destroyer, it's a choice. The Hall of Celestial Judgment was no longer the silent tomb of amethyst light Jaxon Vane had entered in chains. It had become a pressure cooker of shifting loyalties and ancient prejudices, the air itself vibrating with the low-frequency hum of 1,000 nervous Xylos hearts. As Jaxon walked beside Empress Laraxis, no longer a prisoner but a man draped in the heavy, unfamiliar weight of a guest director's mantle, he felt the sensory input of the spire beginning to overwhelm his human faculties. The lumen fibers in the floor didn't just glow, they sang, a discordant chorus of whispers that made his teeth ache. Laraxis moved with a terrifying grace, her silver hair flowing behind her like the ionized tail of a comet. She didn't look at the nobles who hissed as they passed, nor did she acknowledge the high-ranking officers who stood with their hands hovering near the hilts of their vibration blades. Her focus was entirely on the high dais where Counselor Valerius stood, his withered lilac skin now pulsing with a dark, aggressive violet. "Majesty," Valerius's voice boomed through the chamber, stripped of even the pretense of courtesy. "The Earth Coalition destroyer UNS Vengeance has breached the inner perimeter. They have zeroed in on our orbital relays. Admiral Thorne has issued a final ultimatum. Release the human spy within 15 minutes or they begin a kinetic bombardment of the capital. And yet, you walk into this sacred hall with the very contamination that brought this fire to our doorstep." Jaxon felt the eyes of the assembly boring into him like thermal drills. He leaned in toward Laraxis, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The Admiral's a hard charger, Lyra. He doesn't believe in the slow dance. If he says he's going to drop rocks on your head in 15 minutes, he's already got the targeting solutions locked and loaded. We're in the weeds here." Laraxis didn't flinch. She ascended the steps to the throne, her presence expanding until she seemed to dwarf even the massive crystalline pillars of the hall. "Then let us change the frequency of the conversation, Counselor," she said, her voice carrying a resonant power that made the crystals in the walls chime in symphony. "Herald, open a sector-wide broadcast. I want every screen on Xylos Prime, every ship in the orbital ring, and every frequency the UNS Vengeance can receive to be slave to this chamber." "That is madness," Valerius shrieked, his elongated limbs trembling with fury. "You would broadcast our internal deliberations to the enemy? You would expose the cracks in our sovereignty to a human butcher like Thorne?" "There are no cracks, Valerius," Laraxis said, sitting upon the throne with a finality that silenced the room. "Only a truth that has been buried under 7 years of convenient lies." Jaxon Vane stepped forward. Jaxon took a breath, his boots thudding against the mirror-sheen floor. He felt like a grunt walking into a minefield with nothing but a pair of wire cutters and a prayer. He stood at the center of the hall, the transparent dome above revealing the massive, shark-like silhouette of the UNS Vengeance hanging in the amethyst sky like a predator waiting for the first sign of blood. "The broadcast is live, Majesty," the herald announced, his voice trembling. Laraxis leaned forward, her golden eyes burning with a light that seemed to bridge the gap between species. "Admiral Thorne," she began, her words translated into a crisp, authoritative English that echoed across the star system. "And people of the Xylos hegemony, you see before you Jaxon Vane. To your command, Admiral, he is a ghost, a blacklisted lieutenant whose name was erased because he refused to follow an order of abandonment. To my council, he is a trespasser and a spy." She stood again, descending the steps toward Jaxon. The silence in the hall was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. "But I am Empress Laraxis, and I speak a different truth. 7 years ago, in the ruins of Aurelia Prime, I was not a queen. I was a broken child pinned beneath the weight of a dying city. My own people had scuttled the sector to deny it to the coalition. They left me to burn. It was this human, this enemy, who ignored his own extraction, who shielded me with his body when the plasma mortars fell, and who carried me 2 kilometers through a literal hell so that I might live to wear this crown. She reached out, her fingers catching the light as she unfastened the silver brooch at her shoulder. It was the sigil of sovereignty, an artifact that had been passed down through 40 generations of Xylos rulers. Valerius claims that trust is a finite resource, she continued, her gaze sweeping the stunned nobles. He claims that to acknowledge a debt to a human is a contamination. I say that the only contamination in this empire is the fear that blinds us to honor. I, Lyraxis, queen regnant of the Xylos hegemony, invoke the right of recognition. I bind my house, my blood, and my throne to the man who saved the song of my people. She pressed the silver brooch into Jackson's palm, her hand closing over his. The contact triggered a surge of bioluminescence in the lumen fibers of the hall, a blinding wave of gold and white that washed over the assembly. It was the right, the soul debt made manifest. For a heartbeat, Jaxon felt the bridge. He saw fragments of her memory, the terror of the basement, the smell of his singed armor, the lullaby he'd hummed. He felt the weight of her loyalty, a bond that transcended the 7 years of silence. "Lyra," he whispered, his own eyes stinging. The moment was shattered by a violent tremor that shook the spire to its foundation. The transparent dome above rippled as an atmospheric shockwave slammed into it. "Impact!" Thaxis roared, his hands snapping to his comlink. The UNS Vengeance just fired a low-yield kinetic rod into the southern defense grid. They're not waiting for the story. They think the broadcast is a Xylos psyop, a trick to delay their assault. "Admiral Thorne!" Jaxon shouted toward the ceiling, his voice desperate. "This is Vane. Jaxon Vane. I'm standing right here in the spire. Check your thermal signatures. Cease fire, you old war dog. You're going to kill the only chance we have at a ceasefire." A holographic screen flared to life in the center of the hall, showing the Bridge of the Vengeance. Admiral Thorne was a man carved from granite and iron, his uniform crisp, his eyes cold as the void. "Lieutenant Vane," Thorne's voice was like grinding stones. "Or should I call you Director Vane? You were always a sentimental fool, Jaxon. You think I'm going to stand down because the Xylos put on a light show and taught their pet humans some pretty lines? They're using you. They're using your face to mask their mobilization. My scanners show 3 Xylos destroyers moving into flanking positions. I'm finishing what started 7 years ago. I'm glassing the spire." "Thorne, no!" Jaxon screamed. "The destroyers aren't moving to attack. They're under the command of Admiral Choros. They're moving because they think Lyraxis has been compromised. You're both playing right into the hands of the hardliners." "10 minutes, Vane," Thorne said, his image flickering as the spire's electronic warfare suites engaged. "Get to an escape pod if you can, but the spire falls today." The hologram vanished. Valerius let out a chilling, triumphant laugh. "Do you see, Majesty? Your human savior has failed. His own people view him as a puppet. His presence hasn't brought peace. It has brought our annihilation. Commander Thaxis, arrest the Empress. She is clearly under neural manipulation. For the safety of the hegemony, I am assuming emergency control." The wardens, usually loyal to the crown, hesitated. They looked at Lyraxis, then at the burning sky, then at the shivering violet light of Valerius's aura. Fear was a powerful motivator, and the sight of a human destroyer preparing to erase their world was more tangible than an ancient right of honor. "Thaxis, stay frosty," Jaxon warned, his body sliding into a defensive posture he hadn't used in years. He didn't have a rifle, but he had the sigil of sovereignty in his fist and 40 years of survival instincts screaming in his ear. "The counselor is selling you a bill of goods. You turn on her now, and Thorne won't have to fire a single shot. This empire will eat itself from the inside out." "The human is right," Thaxis said, his voice a low growl as he stepped between Valerius and the throne, his vibration blades snapping to life with a deadly blue hum. The Empress recognized him. "The right is bound. I would rather die under a human bombardment with my honor intact than live as a traitor under a vulture's wing." Then you will die, Valerius roared. The hall of celestial judgment erupted. Valerius's loyalists drew their weapons, the air filling with the whine of energy pistols and the clatter of crystal shields. Lyraxis grabbed Jackson's arm, her face set in a mask of regal fury. The broadcast center, she hissed. If Thorn won't listen to words, we have to show him the data. The Spire has a direct link to the orbital relays. If we can override the defense grid and drop the shields, Thorn will see we aren't a threat. But we have to get there before Valerius's people seal the lift shafts. Roger that, Jaxon said, his gray eyes scanning the chaos for an exit. Let's move, Lyra. We've got 9 minutes to save the world, and I'm fresh out of stim packs. As they dived into the spiraling corridors of the Spire, the sounds of civil war began to echo through the crystal halls. It was Aurelia Prime all over again. The smoke, the screaming, the smell of burning lumen fibers. But this time, Jaxon wasn't just shielding one girl. He was trying to hold up a bridge that 100 star systems were trying to burn down. The cost of failure wasn't just a dishonorable discharge this time. It was the silence of a billion voices. The air in the maintenance ducts of the Amethyst Spire tasted like copper and ozone, a flavor Jaxon Vane knew far too well. It was the taste of a dying ship, of systems pushed past their red line, of a mission that was rapidly turning into a Charlie Foxtrot of epic proportions. Jaxon led the way, his fingers digging into the gaps between the translucent crystal plates. Behind him, Lyraxis moved with a silent, feline intensity, her silver dress now torn and stained with the soot of 1,000 small electrical fires. They were 400 meters below the broadcast center, and the Spire was groaning as the UNS Vengeance began its second phase of kinetic bombardment. Each impact sent a shockwave through the crystal that felt like it was trying to shake the marrow from Jackson's bones. Stay frosty, Lyra, Jaxon whispered, pausing at a junction where the sapphire lumen fibers had turned a frantic, bleeding red. We've got wardens in the next shaft. I can hear their diaphragms clicking. Valerius must have bypassed the primary security codes. Lyraxis leaned against the vibrating wall, her breath coming in shallow hitches. He has been planning this for years, Jaxon. The contamination of my throne was merely the spark he needed to light the pyre. He doesn't want peace. He wants a war that will justify the total militarization of our species. He would see Xylos Prime reduced to cinders if it meant he could rule the ash. Typical brass hat logic, Jaxon muttered, checking the charge on a scavenged Xylos pulse pistol. It felt light and alien in his hand, like a toy made of glass, but he knew it could punch a hole through a reinforced bulkhead. He thinks he can control the fire once it's started. He doesn't realize that guys like Thorn don't stop until the target is zeroed out. They moved again, sliding through a narrow ventilation gap that opened into the Spire's primary data conduit. It was a cathedral of light, thousands of miles of fiber optic crystal weaving together into a glowing core that processed the collective knowledge of the hegemony. At the center of the room stood a terminal that looked like a blooming flower of obsidian. There it is, Lyraxis said, stepping onto the gantry. Hold up, Jaxon yelled, lunging forward to grab her waist and pull her back, just as a bolt of blue energy hissed through the air, melting the crystal railing where she'd been standing a second before. Jaxon dived for cover behind a power coupling, pulling Lyraxis down with him. He peeked over the edge, his eyes narrowing. 3 wardens were positioned across the chamber, their ceremonial armor reinforced with tactical plating. And at the center, standing by the terminal, was Admiral Choros. The Xylos admiral didn't look like a politician. He looked like a man who had spent 40 years breathing the recycled air of a warship, his skin a toughened, leathery indigo, his eyes 2 spheres of cold, unyielding gold. He held a heavy disruption cannon leveled at the terminal. Majesty, Choros rumbled, his voice amplified by the room's acoustics. You should have stayed in the guest wing. It would have been a cleaner transition. Admiral, Lyraxis stood, her voice regaining its royal authority, even as Jaxon tried to pull her back down. You were my father's most trusted commander. You held the line at the Vesper Gates. How can you stand with a coward like Valerius? Valerius is a snake, Choros admitted, his gaze flicking to Jaxon, with a hatred so pure it felt physical. But at least he is a Xylos snake. You, Majesty, have bound your soul to a parasite. You have invited a human into the heart of our sanctuary. Do you know what the men on the Vengeance are doing right now? They are laughing. They are watching us tear ourselves apart and preparing to sweep up the pieces. They're not laughing, Admiral, Jaxon shouted from behind the coupling. They're scared. They're scared of a future where they aren't the only big dogs on the block. Thorn is firing because he doesn't know how to do anything else. You're firing for the same reason. You're both just two old ghosts trying to make the world look as ugly as your memories. Silence, Dustwalker! Choros roared, and he fired the disruption cannon. The blast didn't hit Jaxon. It hit the power coupling. A fountain of white-hot sparks erupted, and the spire's artificial gravity flickered, sending Jaxon and Lyraxis drifting into the air for a terrifying 3 seconds before the system compensated. Jaxon hit the floor hard, his shoulders screaming as he rolled and fired the pulse pistol. The blue bolt struck one of the wardens in the chest, the Xylos soldier toppling backward into the data core with a shower of crystalline shards. "Lyra, the terminal!" Jaxon yelled, scrambling to his feet. "I'll hold them off. Get the shields down." What followed was a blur of violence and desperation. Thaxis and a few loyal guards burst through the secondary entrance, engaging the wardens in a brutal, close-quarters struggle. Jaxon moved like a man possessed, utilizing the three-dimensional layout of the conduit room. He jumped from gantry to gantry, his human reflexes, sharpened by 20 years of rescue work in zero-G, surprising the heavier Xylos soldiers. He tackled a warden off a ledge, the two of them plummeting 20 meters before Jaxon caught a maintenance cable, the alien soldier falling into the dark depths of the spire. Jaxon swung back onto the main platform, his breath coming in ragged gasps, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "Sit rep," he roared, sliding into cover beside Thaxis. "Out of juice on the primary weapons," Thaxis shouted back, his armor shattered, his silver blood staining his tunic. "We're fighting with grit and scrap now, human." "It's enough," Lyraxis called out. She was at the terminal, her fingers dancing through the holographic interface. The obsidian petals were glowing with a brilliant, blinding white. "The override is active. I'm slaving the defense grid to my biometric signature. Jaxon, I need you." Jaxon ran to her, the air around the terminal humming with enough static electricity to make the hair on his arm stand up. "What do I do?" "The right," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his. "The Council built a failsafe into the spire's core. It requires 2 distinct biological signatures to drop the planetary shields, a measure to prevent a single mad ruler from surrendering the world. But the signatures must be in resonance. They must be bound." "You mean the soul debt," Jaxon said, understanding flooding through him. "You're using our connection as a physical key." "Yes," Lyraxis said, her hand reaching for his. "Trust me, Jaxon. Trust that the man you were in the basement is the man this world needs now." Jaxon took her hand. The moment their skin touched, the world vanished. He wasn't in the spire anymore. He was everywhere. He felt the vast, cold presence of the UNS Vengeance above them. He felt the fear of the millions of Xylos citizens huddled in the lower sectors. He felt the bitterness of Admiral Thorn and the hunger of Counselor Valerius. But at the center of the storm, he felt Lyraxis. He felt her strength, her guilt, and her desperate, unyielding hope. Bridge. Built. The voice of the spire echoed in his mind. A massive wave of golden light erupted from the spire, a pulse so powerful it was visible from the surface of the moons. Above Xylos Prime, the shimmering violet curtain of the planetary shields didn't just flicker, it dissolved, turning into a shower of harmless, glowing embers that rained through the atmosphere. The UNS Vengeance went silent. The targeting sensors that had been zeroed in on the spire suddenly lost their lock as the enemy defenses vanished. On the holographic screen, Admiral Thorn's face was a map of confusion and dawning realization. "Vane, what did you do?" "I dropped the gun, Admiral," Jaxon said, his voice echoing through the open comlink. "The spire is defenseless. Lyraxis has surrendered the grid. If you fire now, you aren't fighting a war. You're committing a massacre. And I know you, Thorn. You're a hard ass, but you're not a butcher. Look at the data. Look at the people." Thorn stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the fire control console. The bridge of the Vengeance was deathly quiet. "Admiral," a voice came from the destroyer's sensors. "Xylos Fleet Command is powering down their weapons. They're They're transmitting a distress signal, not to their own people, but to us. They're requesting medical assistance for the sectors hit by the initial bombardment. Thorne let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at Jaxon, and for the first time in 7 years, he didn't see a disgraced lieutenant. He saw a man who had finally finished a mission. "All ships stand down," Thorne commanded. "Prepare rescue shuttles. We're going down there to clean up this mess." "And Vane?" "Yeah, Admiral. Don't think this means you're getting your pension back. You still owe me 3,000 marks for that lost drop pod on Aurelia Prime." Jaxon let out a shaky laugh, his knees finally giving out. He slid to the floor, still holding Lyraxis's hand. The red light of the spire was fading, replaced by a soft, calm lavender. The turning point had passed. The bridge had held. But as Jaxon looked at the smoke still rising from the lower levels, he knew the battle wasn't over. Valerius was still in the shadows, and the cost of the peace they'd just bought was written in the blood on the floor. "We did it," Lyraxis whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Yeah," Jaxon said, looking up at the moons through the transparent dome. "But the hard part's just starting, Lyra. Now we have to teach them how to walk across the bridge without looking for a place to plant a bomb." The spire hummed, a low melodic vibration that sounded, for the first time in 7 years, exactly like a song of forgotten dawns. The silence that followed the collapse of the planetary shields was more terrifying than the roar of the kinetic bombardment. It was a vacuum of expectation, a worldwide intake of breath as millions of Xylo's citizens looked up at an amethyst sky no longer protected by the shimmering violet curtain of their ancestors. Jaxon Vane stood in the heart of the spire's data conduit, his hands still fused to Lyraxis's skin by the lingering static of the rite. He could feel the fine tremors in her palm, not of fear, but of a biological exhaustion that threatened to pull them both into the dark. "Status report," Jaxon wheezed, his internal radar screaming as the spire's artificial gravity began to oscillate. "Lyra, talk to me. Are we still breathing, or is the air recycler about to take a dirt nap?" Lyraxis leaned heavily against the obsidian terminal, her silver hair matted with the dust of shattered crystal. "The grid is recalibrating. By dropping the shields, I have forced the spire into a state of total transparency. The human sensors on the Vengeance can now see every nursery, every hospital, and every beating heart on this world. I have gambled everything on the hope that Admiral Thorne's conscience is more than just military protocol." "Thorne's a hard charger, but he's not a butcher," Jaxon grunted, wiping a smear of silver blood and human red from his brow. "He's seeing the data now. 800,000 civilians in the southern arc alone. He won't pull the trigger on a target that's naked. But Valerius, that snake isn't going to just crawl back under a rock." As if summoned by his name, the holographic projectors around the chamber flickered into a violent, discordant violet. It wasn't a standard transmission, it was a ghost signal, bleeding through the maintenance channels. Counselor Valerius's face appeared, distorted by the spire's internal damage. He was no longer in the Hall of Judgment. He was somewhere deeper, the background behind him pulsing with the raw, rhythmic throb of the primary crystal core. "You have betrayed the song, Lyraxis," Valerius hissed, his voice a jagged edge of madness. "You have opened our veins to the Dustwalkers." "You think this surrender brings peace? It brings only the slow rot of our identity. If the hegemony cannot exist in its purity, then it shall not exist at all." Jaxon's blood turned to ice. "Lyra, where is he? That looks like the reactor level." "The heart of the spire," she whispered, her golden eyes widening with horror. "It is the resonance chamber that maintains the structural integrity of every building in the capital. If he destabilizes the harmonics, Jaxon, the entire city will literally vibrate itself into sand." "A scorched earth play," Jaxon muttered, his mind already cycling through tactical scenarios. "He's going to kill his own people to save them from us. That is the ultimate snafu. How many people live in the spire's shadow? 5 million? 10? 12 million, Lyraxis corrected, her voice regaining its steel as she pushed off the terminal. "Thaxis, do you have a visual on the heart?" Commander Thaxis staggered forward, his armor a ruin of cracked plates. He checked a wrist-mounted scanner. "He's locked the secondary bulkheads. He's initiated a resonance overload. We have perhaps 30 minutes before the frequency reaches the breaking point of the singing crystal foundations. Majesty, my men are pinned down by Valerius's loyalists in the lower lift shafts. We can't reach him in time. Jaxon looked at the sigil of sovereignty still clutched in his fist, then at the map of scars on his own wrists. He felt the weight of 7 years of running, 7 years of being a ghost, 7 years of thinking he was broken beyond repair. He looked at Laraxis, the girl he'd carried through fire, now the queen who had stood up for him when the entire universe wanted him in chains. Trust isn't a finite resource, he thought, echoing her words. It's a bridge, and bridges only work if you're willing to walk across them while they're still on fire. Admiral Thorne, Jaxon barked, the comms link to the Vengeance still open. I hope you're listening. We've got a rogue element at the reactor core. If he pops that cherry, this planet becomes a localized asteroid field. I need a tactical insertion at the base of the spire. Human rescue pods, high velocity. And Thorne? Speak, Vane, the Admiral's voice crackled, no longer cold but carrying the weight of a man who realized the stakes had moved beyond territory. Send the medics, real ones, not just for me, but for the Xylos civilians. If we're going to do this, we do it as one team. No blueskins, no dustwalkers, just survivors. Do you copy? There was a long, agonizing pause. On the screen, Jaxon saw Thorne look at his bridge crew, then back at the scan of Xylos Prime. A world currently stripped of its armor, vulnerable and pleading. Insertion pods launched, Thorne said. 60 seconds to impact. Good hunting, Jaxon. Don't make me regret this. Jaxon turned to Laraxis. We have to go, Lyra. We're the only ones with the biometric keys to override that resonance. You and me, the Queen and the Ghost. It is a suicide run, Jaxon Vane, she said, but she was already reaching for a vibration blade discarded by a fallen guard. Suicide runs are my specialty, Jaxon grinned, though it was a tight, pained expression. Besides, I've got a bridge to build, and I'm not leaving until the last rivet is in place. They dived into the maintenance chute, sliding down the long, spiraling throat of the spire. The air was becoming thick with the sound of the destabilizing crystals. A high-pitched, keening shriek that felt like it was trying to shatter Jaxon's skull. As they descended, the spire groaned, thousands of tons of living crystal shifting as the foundations began to lose their harmonic lock. They hit the reactor level with a bone-jarring thud. The room was a cathedral of light, dominated by a massive, rotating crystal that pulsed with a blinding, erratic violet. Valerius stood at the primary console, his hands buried in the control gel, his eyes vacant as he merged his consciousness with the spire's death song. Valerius! Lyraxis roared, her voice amplified by the resonance of the room. Stop this! Look at what you are doing! You are murdering the very world you claim to protect. The counselor turned, his face a mask of zealotry. I am purifying it, Majesty. The humans are already landing. I can feel their heavy boots on our soil. I can smell their greed. It is better to be a memory of glory than a living monument to shame. 6 wardens, Valerius's personal guard, stepped from the shadows, their rifles leveled at Jaxon and Laraxis. These weren't the confused soldiers from the throne room. These were the true believers, the men who had been fed a diet of hatred for 40 years. Jaxon, Laraxis whispered, her blade humming. I see them, Jaxon said, his pulse pistol steady. Stay behind me, Lyra. I've spent 7 years being a shield. I'm not stopping now. The firefight was a blur of blue energy and violet sparks. Jaxon moved with a desperate, frantic efficiency, utilizing the reactor's cooling vanes for cover. He didn't fire to kill. He fired to disable, his rescue worker instinct still fighting the soldier's training. He took a bolt to the shoulder, the heat searing through his tunic and into the old scar tissue, but he didn't stop. He tackled one warden, slamming him into a crystalline pillar, then rolled to avoid a blast that melted the floor plate. Laraxis was a whirlwind of silver and steel beside him, her movements a dance of regal violence. She parried, she struck, and she moved with a grace that Jaxon could only describe as poetic. But the keening of the crystal was reaching a crescendo. The walls of the reactor room were beginning to crack, fine lines of white appearing in the amethyst bedrock. 10 minutes! Thaxis's voice crackled through the local comms. The resonance is at 94%. Jaxon, if you don't shut it down now, the spire is gone. Jaxon saw the opening. Valerius was distracted, his focus entirely on the core. Jaxon sprinted across the open floor, the warden's fire tracking him. A bolt grazed his thigh, another punched through his mantle. He didn't care. He leaped over the primary console, tackling Valerius into the control gel. The mental feedback was like being plunged into a star. Jaxon screamed as the spire's collective consciousness, the fear, the history, the song, flooded his human brain. He saw centuries of Xylos suffering, the wars they had fought, the beauty they had built. And he saw the poison Valerius had injected into that history. "Get out of my head!" Jaxon roared, his fingers digging into the counselor's throat. Valerius clawed at Jackson's face, his metallic eyes glowing with a dying fire. "You are nothing, Dust Walker. You cannot stop the end." "I'm not stopping it," Jaxon gritted out, his voice a raw, bloody sound. "I'm fixing it." He grabbed Lyraxis's hand, pulling her into the control gel with them. The trio was now linked, the Zealot, the Queen, and the Fixing Man. "Lyra!" Jaxon screamed through the mental noise. "Give them the lullaby, the song from the basement. The resonance of the core needs a new frequency. It needs to remember what it felt like to be saved." Lyraxis understood instantly. She didn't fight the core. She embraced it. She began to hum, the melody from 7 years ago, the song of forgotten dawns, resonating through the control gel. Jaxon added his own resonance, his loyalty to the girl he'd saved, his hope for a world that didn't have to burn, and the sheer, stubborn grit of a man who refused to walk away. The discordant keening of the crystal began to shift. The violent violet light softened, turning to a warm, steady indigo. The cracks in the walls stopped spreading. The spire's groan became a hum of relief. Valerius let out one final strangled cry before the feedback of the peace song overwhelmed his hatred. He slumped forward, unconscious or dead, his mind unable to survive a frequency of pure empathy. Jaxon and Lyraxis fell back from the console, gasping for air as the gravity finally stabilized. The silence that followed was different now. It was the silence of a fever breaking. "We did it," Jaxon whispered, his vision swimming. "Yes," Lyraxis said, her hand still clutching his, her skin glowing with a soft, bioluminescent warmth. "We built the bridge, Jaxon Vane." But as Jaxon looked at his hands, he saw that they were stained with more than just dust. He saw the cost of the bridge, the blood of the wardens, the scars on his body, and the shattered pieces of an old empire. He felt the pain of the transformation, the realization that he could never go back to being just a fixer. He was a part of this world now, bound to it by a debt that was no longer just his own. Outside, through the cracks in the reactor room ceiling, Jaxon could see the first human rescue pods touching down in the city. He saw the white uniformed medics emerging, not with rifles, but with trauma kits. And he saw the Xylos citizens reaching out, hesitant but alive. The war for the Spire was over. The war for the future was just beginning. The medical bay of the UNS Vengeance had been transported planetside, a modular fortress of sterile white plastic and humming monitors set up in the shadow of the Amethyst Spire. It was a surreal sight. Terran Marines in heavy combat suits standing guard alongside Xylos wardens whose ceremonial armor was still scorched from civil war. Between them, a steady stream of survivors moved through the triage lines, their species differences blurred by the universal language of shock and relief. Jaxon Vane lay on a bioregeneration slab, his back exposed to the flickering amber light of a human dermal knitter. The machine buzzed as it worked to fuse the fresh plasma burns with the 7-year-old map of shrapnel scars. Every pulse of the laser felt like a needle of ice, but the physical pain was a grounding presence compared to the sensory overload still echoing in his skull. "You're a real piece of work, Jaxon," a voice boomed from the doorway. Jaxon didn't have to look up to know it was Admiral Thorne. The heavy, measured thud of the Admiral's boots was unmistakable. Thorne walked to the side of the slab, his arms crossed over a chest adorned with 42 years of military honors. He looked down at Jackson's back, his eyes narrowing as he studied the intricate topography of the scars. "I've seen a lot of combat injuries in my time," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rumble. "But I've never seen a man take a direct mortar spray to the spine and keep walking. You should have been zeroed out 7 years ago, Vane. Why weren't you?" "I had a cargo to deliver, Admiral," Jaxon wheezed, his face pressed into the padded headrest. "And I've always been a stubborn bastard when it comes to deadlines." Thorne let out a short, dry huff of breath. "The Xylos are calling it the miracle of the core. My tech officers are having a brain aneurysm trying to figure out how a human and an alien managed to tune a planetary reactor with a lullaby. They're saying it's a biological impossibility. Maybe your tech officers should spend less time with their manuals and more time in the weeds," Jaxon grunted. "The hegemony's tech isn't just machines, Admiral. It's resonant. It responds to what's inside the operator. Valerius was running on high-octane hate. Lyra and we just gave it something else to chew on." Thorne sat on the edge of a nearby crate, his gaze drifting to the window where the first joint medical teams were heading into the lower city. "I received the data burst from the Spire's conduit, the records of Aurelia Prime, the real ones, not the sanitized versions High Command pushed through the shredder." Jaxon went still. And I realized that I've spent 7 years hating a shadow," Thorne said, his voice carrying a rare note of vulnerability. "My nephew was on the mercy of Solace. I thought he died because of human insubordination. I thought you abandoned the mission and left those people to burn. Seeing those images, seeing you shield that girl." Thorne paused, his hand gripping the edge of the crate until the plastic creaked. "You didn't abandon the mission, Vane. You were the only one who actually finished it. Doesn't change the fact that I'm still blacklisted, Admiral," Jaxon said, though the bitterness felt hollow now. "Not anymore," Thorne said, standing up and handing Jaxon a data slate. "I've already transmitted my report to the Earth Senate. I've initiated a full inquiry into the Aurelia Prime cover-up. Your commission is being reinstated retroactively, and the Senate has approved the preliminary funding for your Joint Rescue Corps." Jaxon blinked, his gray eyes scanning the text on the slate. It was all there. The signatures, the stamps, the official recognition he'd thought he'd never see again. "Vanguard Mercy Corps," he whispered, reading the proposed name. "The Empress insisted on it," Thorne added, a ghost of a smile touching his leathery face. "She said the world needed a shield that wasn't a wall. She's waiting for you, by the way, in the Spire's gardens. She refused to leave until she saw you standing on your own 2 feet." Jaxon forced himself to sit up, the dermal knitter whining in protest. His back felt tight, the new skin sensitive and raw, but for the first time in 7 years, he felt like he could stand without leaning on a lie. He pulled on a fresh tunic, a deep blue garment provided by the Xylos attendants, and checked his internal radar. The world outside the medbay was a chaos of reconstruction. He walked through the triage camp, seeing a human Marine sharing a ration pack with a Xylos child. He saw a Xylos medic teaching a human nurse the proper way to stabilize a singing crystal fracture. It wasn't perfect. There were still glares, still whispered insults, still the heavy, suffocating scent of 4 decades of distrust. But the bridge was there. It was fragile, and it was made of blood and bone, but it was holding. He found Lyraxis in the upper gardens, a soaring platform of living flora that had miraculously survived the bombardment. She was standing by the edge, looking out at the city where 12 million lights were beginning to flicker back to life as the power grid stabilized. She had replaced her torn gown with a simple, elegant robe of silver and amber, her sigil of sovereignty pinned back at her shoulder. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Lyraxis said without turning around. Her ears flickered toward him, tracking the rhythm of his uneven gait. "I'm getting used to the feeling," Jaxon said, moving to stand beside her. The scent of wildflowers was stronger here, mixing with the cool, damp air of the garden. "Thorne says the Senate signed off on the Mercy Corps. It's official. We're going to be the most hated people in the sector for at least a decade." "Good," Lyraxis said, finally turning to face him. Her golden eyes were clear, the exhaustion replaced by a vibrant, determined fire. "Comfort is a dangerous thing, Jaxon Vane. It breeds the kind of complacency that allowed Valerius to flourish. I would rather be hated for building a bridge than loved for maintaining a wall." She reached out, her fingers brushing the fresh grafts on his wrists. Does it still hurt? Only when I think about the paperwork, Jaxon joked, but his voice lacked its usual cynicism. He looked at her, seeing not just the queen, but the girl who had promised never to forget. Lyra, you realize that by doing this, by bringing humans into the spire, you've permanently changed your empire. You can't go back to the way it was. I don't want to go back, she said softly. The Xylos hegemony was a lonely armored fortress. We were so busy protecting our song that we forgot how to sing it for anyone else. You taught me that honor isn't about purity, it's about choosing to stand in the fire for someone who doesn't even speak your language. Jaxon looked out at the city, at the three moons reflecting in the translucent towers of the spire. He felt the pain in his back, a constant reminder of the price he'd paid. But he also felt the resonance of the spire, no longer a shriek of overload, but a low, harmonious thrum that felt right. Thorn wants me to head back to Earth for the formal signing, Jaxon said, turning back to her. He says the brass hats want to make a big show of it. The broken sentinel returning as a hero. It makes me want to vomit. Then don't go as a hero, Lyraxis said, her hand catching his and squeezing tight. Alien skin against human. Trust against fear. Go as a bridge. Show them that the scars aren't just remnants of the war. They are the foundations of the peace. Jaxon looked down at their joined hands. He realized then that the transformation wasn't just about treaties or rescue stations. It was about him. He had walked into the spire in shackles, thinking his life was an epilogue to a tragedy. But here he was, standing in the dawn of a new chapter, his soul finally in resonance with the world around him. All right, Lyra, Jaxon said, his voice steady and strong. Let's go tell the galaxy that the fixing man is back in business. And this time, we're not just patching engines. As they walked from the garden together, the spire's crystals began to glow a soft, radiant gold, the color of a Xylo's soul in peace. It was a song that wouldn't be forgotten, a melody forged in the basement of a library and perfected in the heart of a reactor. The bridge was built. Now they just had to teach the universe how to cross it. The dust of Xylos Prime did not settle quickly. It lingered in the amethyst air like a billion tiny shards of memory, refracting the light of the three moons into a bruised, shimmering haze. For Jaxon Vane, the week following the miracle of the core felt less like a victory and more like the slow, painful decompression of a deep-sea diver returning to the surface. His body was a tapestry of fresh regeneration in old trauma. But for the first time in 7 years, the hum in his head wasn't the discordant static of a resonant shackle. It was the steady, rhythmic pulse of a world trying to remember how to breathe. He stood on the observation deck of the Vanguard Mercy Corps' temporary headquarters, a modular human structure grafted onto the crystalline foundations of the spire's outer ring. Below him, the capital city was a hive of activity. It was a sight that would have been impossible a mere 10 days ago. Heavy Terran lifters, painted in the stark white and red of the rescue services, hovered alongside elegant Xylos skiffs, together lowering prefabricated housing units into the gaps where Valerius's resonance overload had shattered the singing crystal. The sensors are picking up a localized thermal spike in the Vash quarter, a voice announced over the comms. It was Vex, the young Xylos pilot who had once been Jaxon's captor and was now his lead flight officer. Looks like a residual energy pocket from the reactor flare. We've got a team on the ground, but they're requesting heavy-duty fixing. You in the mood for some grease work, boss? Jaxon keyed his headset, a lopsided grin touching his lips. Tell them to hold their horses, Vex. I'm on my way. And tell the Terran team to stop trying to use those magnetic wrenches on the lumen fiber. You'll short-circuit the whole block if you're not careful. Copy that, boss. I'll tell the grunts to stop playing with the shiny toys. Jaxon turned to leave, but stopped when he saw Commander Thaxis standing in the doorway. The Xylos officer looked different without his ceremonial glass armor. He wore a simple tactical vest over a dark tunic, the silver bloodstains from the reactor fight replaced by the clean, sharp lines of the new Joint Command insignia. You are a difficult man to track down, Jaxon Vane, Thaxis said, his metallic eyes reflecting the morning light. Your Admiral Thorn has been looking for you. He says there is a mountain of paperwork regarding the formal dissolution of your blacklist status and he refuses to sign the final page until you've looked him in the eye. Thorn just wants to see if I've turned purple yet, Jaxon grunted, leaning against the railing. The man has a heart of iron, but he's terrified of anything he can't solve with a kinetic rod. How are your people holding up, Thaxis? I heard there was another protest in the northern sectors. Thaxis moved to stand beside him, his elongated fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern on his thigh. The separatists are loud, yes. They call this an occupation disguised as aid. They see the human medics and think of the bombs from Aurelia Prime. Trust is a slow-growing vine, human. It does not like the cold, and right now the shadows of our history are very long. I get it, Jaxon said softly. I spent 7 years hating every blue-skinned face in the galaxy because I thought it was easier than feeling guilty about the people I couldn't save. But Thaxis, look down there. He pointed to a group of children, human and Xylos, playing in the shadow of a grounded rescue shuttle. They don't see an occupation. They just see people who brought the lights back on. That has to count for something. It counts for everything. A new voice joined them. Empress Lyraxis stepped onto the deck, her presence as commanding as ever, though she had traded her silver gowns for a suit of reinforced flight silk. She looked like a woman who was ready to build an empire instead of just ruling one. The Council has officially ratified the Vanguard Mandate, she announced, her golden eyes locking onto Jaxon's. The Joint Rescue Corps is no longer a pilot program. It is a sovereign entity, answerable to neither the hegemony nor the coalition. We are the bridge, Jaxon, a bridge built on the sole debt of two people who refuse to be enemies. That's a lot of weight for one bridge, Lyra, Jaxon said, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. We have strong foundations, she replied, reaching out to touch the sigil of sovereignty that was still pinned to his chest. He had tried to return it 3 times, and 3 times she had refused. I have spent the morning in the lower levels, speaking with the families who were trapped when the resonance failed. Do you know what they told me? They didn't ask about human spies or Xylos purity. They asked when the fixing man was coming back to tune their singing walls. Jaxon looked away, feeling a heat in his chest that had nothing to do with radiation burns. I'm just a guy with a wrench, Lyra. I'm not a symbol. In a universe that specializes in breaking things, Jaxon, a man with a wrench is the most powerful symbol there is, she countered. The moment was interrupted by the heavy, measured thud of Admiral Thorne's boots. The old war dog walked onto the deck, looking out of place in the garden-like atmosphere of the spire. He looked at Lyraxis, offering a stiff military nod that was the closest he would ever get to a boo. Majesty, Vane, Thorne said, his voice like grinding stones. The Earth Senate has finished their initial inquiry. The men who sealed the records of Aurelia Prime are facing a military tribunal. They're being charged with gross negligence and the erasure of service records. Your name is clear, Jaxon. Not that it'll do you much good on Earth. You're the most famous traitor and hero in the system, depending on which newsfeed you watch. I've always preferred the fringe anyway, Admiral, Jaxon said. The air is cleaner out here. Thorne grunted, his gaze shifting to the horizon where his destroyer, the UNS Vengeance, was preparing to return to Slipstream. I'm leaving 2 frigates under your command, Vane, the Mercy and the Solace. Names are a bit on the nose, but the crews are top-notch. Mostly volunteers who are tired of shooting at things and want to see if they can actually fix something for once. I'll take good care of them, Admiral. Just don't expect them to stay pretty. Rescue work is a dirty business. I expect nothing less, Thorne said. He paused, his cold eyes softening for a split second. You did good, son. You finished the mission. 7 years late, but you finished it. As Thorne departed, the reality of the aftermath began to settle over the trio. Valerius was in a high-security stasis pod, his mind shattered by the empathetic feedback of the Corps, a living monument to the cost of unchecked hatred. The hardliners on both sides were retreating into the shadows, silenced for now by the sheer, undeniable reality of the miracle. But Jaxon knew the peace was fragile. It was a localized event, a single world choosing to stop the fire. Beyond the Xylos system, the proxy wars still raged. Other worlds were burning, other girls were pinned under rubble, and other soldiers were being told to turn their backs and run. We're launching the first long-range mission tomorrow, Lyraxis said, as if reading his thoughts. The mining colonies in the Vesper Belt. They've been hit hard by the atmospheric shifts. Human and Xylos miners, trapped together in the dark. They are waiting for a voice they can trust. Jaxon straightened his spine, the scars on his back pulling with a familiar, grounding pain. He looked at the Empress, then at the commander, and finally at the vast, uncaring void beyond the moons. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He wasn't a freight hauler running from a dishonorable past. He was a fixer, and the universe was full of broken things. "All right," Jaxon said, his voice steady and full of a new, resonant purpose. "Tell the teams to prep the pods. We've got 12 million neighbors to look after here, and a whole lot of strangers out there who need to know that the bridge is open for business. Thaxis, get the heavy lifters ready. Lyra, stay close. I think I'm going to need someone to hum that tune if the static gets too loud." As the sons of Xylos Prime began their slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the healing city, Jaxon Vane finally stepped off the observation deck. He didn't walk like a prisoner. He didn't walk like a man in chains. He walked like a man who had found the frequency of his own soul, moving toward a future that was no longer a catastrophe, but a choice. 4 months had passed since the Amethyst Spire had nearly become a funeral pyre for 12 million souls. In the high-altitude shipyards of Xylos Prime, the air was a frantic symphony of industrial whine and melodic crystal cutting. Jaxon Vane stood on the primary gantry of the Aurelia's Dawn, the first purpose-built heavy response vessel of the Vanguard Mercy Corps. The ship was a beautiful, jagged contradiction, thick Terran hull plating reinforced with Xylos lumen fibers that pulsed a soft, reassuring blue. It didn't carry a single kinetic rod or plasma cannon. Instead, its bays were packed with trauma tanks, atmospheric scrubbers, and thousands of high-velocity rescue pods. Jaxon adjusted the collar of his uniform. It was a simple charcoal gray, stripped of all nationalistic markings, bearing only the silver sigil of a bridge spanning a stylized sun. At 41 years old, his dark hair was now shot through with more silver than he liked to admit, and the lines around his eyes had deepened into permanent trenches. But the stiffness in his gait was gone, replaced by a fluid, purposeful energy. He was no longer a man dragging the weight of his chains. He was a man who used that weight to anchor others. "Check the seals on the starboard hangar," Jaxon barked, his voice carrying through the hangar deck with the practiced authority of someone who had spent his life in the weeds. "I want those pods ready to punch through a Class 5 solar storm. We're not losing a single soul because someone forgot to tighten a coupling." "Seals are green, Director," a human technician shouted back, giving him a thumbs up from the top of a maintenance ladder. Beside the technician, a Xylos engineer was singing a low, resonant tone to calibrate the pod's inertial dampeners, the crystal components glowing in response to the alien's voice. Jaxon nodded, his gray eyes scanning the organized chaos. This was the action he had craved, the literal, physical manifestation of the trust he and Lyraxis had fought for. It wasn't about speeches or treaties anymore. It was about the way a human hand held a Xylos wrench and the way an alien ear listened for the hitch in a human life support system. "You are hovering again, Jaxon Vane," a melodic voice murmured behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know Lyraxis was there. She had arrived without the fanfare of her royal guard, wearing her own Vanguard uniform. She looked less like an empress and more like a partner, though the golden fire in her eyes still carried the weight of her 17 star systems. "Just making sure the rivets are straight, Lyra," Jaxon said, finally turning to face her. "Thorne's leaving the orbital ring in 2 hours. He's heading back to the Coalition to oversee the integration of the first Xylos diplomatic attachés. The man looks like he's about to have a nervous breakdown, but he's doing it. He's actually doing it." Lyraxis stepped up to the gantry railing, looking out at the sprawling shipyard. The Admiral is a soldier who has discovered that peace requires more courage than war. It is a painful realization for his kind, and for mine. She paused, her fingers brushing the scars on Jackson's wrists. "Are you ready for this? The Vesper Belt is a lawless place. The mining guilds there don't care about soul debts or miracles. They only care about the ore. I've spent half my life in places that didn't care about me, Lyra," Jaxon said. "The Vesper miners are scared, overworked, and breathing bad air. They don't need a lecture on interspecies harmony. They just need to know that if their shaft collapses, someone is coming for them. Someone who won't ask for their ID before pulling them out of the dark. Then let us go and show them," she said, her hand slipping into his. The launch of the Aurelia's Dawn was not a silent affair. As the massive ship cleared the spire's gravity well, the living crystals of the capital city began to chime, a worldwide song of farewell and hope that vibrated through the ship's hull and into the very marrow of Jackson's bones. It was a sound he had once associated with terror, but now it was a lullaby for a new age. In the quiet of his quarters that night, as the ship punched through the velvet black of slipstream, Jackson sat at his small desk. He held the shard of singing crystal Laraxis had given him 7 years ago. It didn't glow anymore, but in the dim light of the cabin, he could see the reflection of his own face in its faceted surface. He looked at the man he had become, the fixer of more than just machines. I spent 7 years thinking my scars were just damage, Jackson thought, his mind drifting back to the long, bitter nights on the cargo runs. I thought they were the tally marks of every failure, every person I couldn't carry, and every order I couldn't follow. I used them as armor, a way to keep the world at a distance so it couldn't hurt me again. I told myself that being a ghost was the only way to survive in a universe that only saw people as assets or enemies. But I was wrong. These scars aren't just damage. They're the weld points. They're the places where I was broken and then put back together with something stronger than just skin and bone. They're the evidence that I stayed when I should have run. Lyra taught me that trust isn't a feeling you wait for. It's a bridge you decide to build while the ground is still shaking beneath your feet. It's the choice to see the person in the rubble instead of the uniform they're wearing. We've saved 800 souls in the last month. 800 people who will go home and tell their families that a human and a Xylos pulled them out of the dark together. That's how the fire stops. Not with a treaty signed in a gilded hall, but with 1,000 small choices made in the mud and the smoke. It's messy, it's painful, and most days it feels like we're trying to hold up the sky with a couple of rusty jacks. But for the first time in my life, I'm not running. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The ship's proximity alarm chimed, a soft amber tone. Jackson stood up, tucking the crystal shard into a secure pocket over his heart. He checked his internal radar. The first mining colony of the Vesper Belt was appearing on the long-range scanners. They were calling for help. Jackson walked onto the bridge, his presence an anchor for the mixed crew. Laraxis was already at the tactical station, her eyes scanning the data streams. "Sit rep," Jackson commanded, his voice steady and full of the authority he had finally earned. "Mining Station Omicron," Vex reported from the pilot's chair. "A structural collapse in the lower quartz veins. We've got 42 miners trapped, oxygen levels at 15%. The local guild is refusing to send a rescue team because the risk-to-profit ratio is too high." Jackson looked at Laraxis. She nodded, a fierce, beautiful pride shining in her golden eyes. "Ignore the guild," Jackson said, his hands dancing across the pod deployment console. "We're not here for the ore. We're here for the people. Vanguard teams, prep for high-velocity insertion. We're going down into the weeds." He moved to the lead rescue pod, his boots thudding against the deck plates with the sound of a man who knew his worth. He strapped himself into the pilot's seat, the familiar harness a second skin. He looked at the screen, at the small, flickering lights of the trapped miners, and he felt the bridge hold. "This is Director Vane to Omicron Station," he said into the comms, his voice ringing through the void. "Hold on to your hats, folks. We're coming for you, and we're bringing the fixing man." As the pod launched into the dark, trailing a streak of brilliant, hopeful blue lumen fire, Jaxon Vane smiled. He had walked into the spire in shackles, thinking his story was over. But as he plunged toward the next fire, he realized he was only on chapter 1. "I spent years carrying my resentment like a shield, only to realize it was actually a prison that kept me from the very connection I was dying for. I look at my scars now, and I don't see shame. I see the places where I chose to stay when the world told me to run. I wonder, what are the scars you are hiding, thinking they make you less? And what would happen if you realized they were actually the strongest parts of the bridge you are meant to build?" Jackson gripped the controls of the rescue pod as it hit the upper atmosphere of the mining moon, the vibration of the descent harmonizing with the soft, steady hum of the crystal shard in his pocket. Beside him, through the comms link, he heard the melodic humming of Laraxis, their two voices weaving together into a single, unbreakable frequency that cut through the darkness of the void.